Indeed, and good afternoon. I would like to apologise to the translators because I may be going a little faster than they would like me to. It's a great honour to be invited here today by the Korean Press Foundation, and a great honour to be introduced by the Prime Minister, who said in a pre-reception that he said, "Oh, I have heard about you." I don't know if that is a good thing or a bad thing. I'm the director of the Tow Center at Columbia University in New York. It's a particular honor for me to be in Korea. When I was a professional journalist working for The Guardian, I often looked at the Korean market where there was great innovation. And I remember, as head of digital at The Guardian, Oh My News was perhaps one of the most inspiring operations which really shaped how we thought about journalism. And I'm happy to say as well now at the Tow Center, some of our best students have also come from South Korea. So please keep sending us your young people, and we will hopefully turn them into journalists that help shape the world in a good way. In fact, here is the Tow Center. These are our students who are hacking, taking part in a hack here on automated journalism. These are the kinds of things that we want to be training our journalists for in the future as we head into a territory of unknown platform influence, whether it's augmented reality, artificial intelligence, voice that perhaps comes through your speaker and delivers your journalism that way. What I wanted to talk about today, though, was the power of large-scale technology platforms, because there are many differences between the Korean market and the US market. You have a comparatively small market, though actually it's about the same size as the UK market where I come from. You have a single language. America is a huge market. It's very diverse regionally. But I believe that we have one thing in common in every single press market in the world at the moment, and that is the disruption that large-scale technology platforms are bringing to journalism. Almost 3 years ago to the day, I gave a speech actually at Oxford with Professor David Levy invited me to give, where I asked the question, Silicon Valley and journalism, should it make up, should it have a closer relationship, or should it break up? Should it have a more distant relationship? At the time, 3 years ago, I felt like the biggest challenge we had as journalists was negotiating a new relationship with social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Snapchat, WeChat, Line, many other social messaging apps. You have your own platforms here in Korea, which is great to see because you're not quite so dependent as the rest of the world is on technology, which is made in the west coast of America. How can journalism take advantage of the many new possibilities large platforms offered without losing its independence? So what I didn't anticipate 3 years ago was how much effort big technology companies would put into getting journalists to put material onto their platforms. We've had Apple News, Google AMP, Facebook Instant Articles, Twitter Moments, Snapchat Discover. These are all methodologies now for getting journalists to create much more material which goes directly to big platform companies. And it seemed to me, perhaps even 2 years ago, that we would have a new era of journalism where publishers would find more revenue from technology companies, and technology companies, who are the new gatekeepers, would compete with each other, and that would really favor our business. But as you all know, because you are journalists, events seldom turn out as you imagine they are going to. And so what we've actually seen, and particularly in America in the past 12 months, is a really extraordinary period of revelation about what actually has happened to our news environment. And it is not, I'm afraid, all good news. I wanted to actually just illustrate what I think is happening by three, if you like, by three incidents, all of which happened in the same week, 2 weeks ago in the States. The first one was that Google, Facebook, and Twitter found themselves hauled in front of the Congressional Judiciary Committee hearings for the first time. They were there to answer questions about how Russian propaganda had managed to circulate on their platforms, apparently without their knowledge, in a way which may have influenced the 2016 election. Google, there are some of the adverts that were paid for by overseas actors. They are not the most sophisticated, yet they're highly effective. Facebook originally said, well, this was only $100,000 of advertising spend. It really wasn't that influential. Fortunately, we have independent researchers like our own research director at the Tow Centre, who is an academic called Jonathan Albright, who through using new journalistic and research techniques of analysis, network analysis, proved that, in fact, the posts had not been seen just by a very small number of people, but by tens of millions of people, because of the way that Facebook circulates the news. The congressional hearings are symbolically very important. It's the first time the platform companies have had to answer questions about their reach into the publishing business. Their appearance in Washington, D.C. speaks to a growing awareness as well that the problem that people are targeted with material through algorithms without necessarily knowing the source or the reason they are being targeted. Journalists and researchers have been key to unearthing what the epidemic of fake news, propaganda, and misinformation really looks like on these platforms. There's a journalist called Craig Silverman, who I'm sure you've heard of at BuzzFeed in America, who proved, if you like, that in the last weeks of the election campaign, so this is between February and Election Day, when he analyzed stories on Facebook, the largest stories from mainstream news are the black line, and they're going downwards. The fake news stories are the red line, which are going upwards. And he proved that, in fact, the most popular fake news stories were performing far better on Facebook at the end of the election campaign than stories from the reported media. And this, if you like, is the underlying symptom, or rather, this is a symptom of the underlying problem, which is technology platforms are rewarding, perhaps unwittingly, the creation of cheap, often misleading viral information, but they are not necessarily allowing for the development of high-quality journalism at the same time. So the second thing to happen, so while this is happening to Facebook, you would imagine this is very bad news for them to be hauled up in front of the government. This also happened in the same weeks that they were in Washington. This is a chart of the growth of monthly active users on Facebook. And you can see that this spans from third quarter of 2015 to the third quarter of 2017. So in other words, throughout what is perhaps the biggest crisis, certainly in their organization, and perhaps also the biggest crisis in a way in American politics, they've just continued to grow. Also, interestingly, the rest of the world and Asia Pacific being the largest blue slice there, are growing now much quicker than Europe and America. So in other words, it doesn't matter in a way how problematic your content is, you are still growing very, very quickly. And at the same time, the revenues from Facebook also grew to a profit of $4.7 billion in one quarter last year, and that is on the advertising model. And then the third thing that happened last week, so we have congressional hearings exposing a rotten information environment. We have yet more proof that really nothing stops the growth of technology platforms. And we also had the closure of more journalistic outlets in the United States. In New York, one of the richest one of the richest cities in America and one of the most densely populated, media-centric cities in the world, Two of its native digital reporting platforms, DNA Info and Gothamist, both closed with no notice. The reason given was the unionization of their staff, but actually the underlying reason was that they are just not making enough revenue from advertising. A 40-year-old alt weekly, the Baltimore City Paper, also closed on the same day. And also on the same day, this is not just about new flimsy brands, this is also about very successful brands. Teen Vogue, which has been a magazine that's been really remarkable in how it has reinvented itself, announced that it would shut its print edition. Well, maybe print editions are old-fashioned, but it's still a sign that it doesn't really matter who you are, even in the biggest media market in the world, you are put under now intolerable pressure if you're advertising, if your model for business is advertising. It's the case that Facebook has said that it does care about journalism, and it cares about journalism to the extent that it will want to crack down on abuses of using its platform. In fact, Mark Zuckerberg incidentally was too busy to go and talk to lawmakers in Washington, but he was not too busy to talk to the investors in his company, which I suppose is a sign of how Facebook orders its priorities. He says they would hire tens of thousands more curators to make sure that the information security on their platform was improved. I think the 2016 election in America is a watershed moment for how platforms are going to exercise their power over news organizations. And I do think it's possible, or not even possible, but likely, that Google, Facebook, Twitter, and others all want to see good journalism flourish on their platforms. I think they will only allow that to happen on their terms. The pressure the big platforms have been placed under to improve their content is already having consequences. Google recently readjusted its algorithm to cut out extremist content which was appearing at the top of its search results. Unfortunately, algorithms, contrary to their reputation, are not very clever, and they cut out sites which also reported on extremism. So this is the traffic at the top of a site called Alternet, which is a news site that reports on extremist content. And you can see where it falls off the edge there is where Google changed its algorithm. And Don Hazen, the executive editor, said, the more that we dig, the more we learn about Google's cozy relationship with corporate media and traditional forms of journalism. It appears that Google has pushed popular, high-traffic, progressive websites to the margins and embrace corporate media, a move that seriously questions its fairness. Some speculate Google is trying to protect itself from critics of fake news at the expense of valid, independent outlets. And here is an experiment that Facebook has been conducting in 6 smaller markets where it has removed the news stories from its news feed and put them in a separate area. And this falls into the category of be careful what you wish for. These are the traffic figures of the 6 major media outlets in Slovakia, where the test of removing the news posts, the 60 biggest, it's not 6, it's 60 biggest Slovakian media outlets. Since Facebook removed their news from the feed, the traffic has decreased by over half since the test. So this shows again, perhaps, an unpleasant or unwelcome lesson that even if we want to be skeptical about the power of large-scale platforms, we're actually incredibly dependent on their outlets for our traffic. And incidentally, many American news organizations, when they saw this was happening in places like Guatemala and Slovakia, said if this happens in America, this will be a catastrophe for our businesses. Other people might argue that the catastrophe was allowing Facebook to have this power over your traffic in the first place. Perhaps the most vivid example and the most difficult example of how technology platforms have or can control media happened in the summer of 2017. There was a Nazi march for the first time in 40 years in Charlottesville, in Virginia, in the United States. It was organized through Facebook pages that were created by a far-right publication called the Daily Stormer. The Daily Stormer also circulated really grotesque stories about a woman who was killed during the protests. She had been an anti-Nazi demonstrator, and she was run over and killed. When they circulated this story about her, every single technology platform that had previously supported the Daily Stormer's content cut it off. So it was kicked off Google, it was kicked off Facebook, it was kicked off Amazon, and it was kicked off a platform called Cloudflare, which is actually a protection software that stops sites from being attacked by hackers. Now, this may not be a bad thing. There are certain places, like Germany, which has strict speech laws, where the Daily Stormer would never have been allowed to publish. But America is very proud of its free speech heritage and the First Amendment protections that you can have the right to say whatever you like, however offensive it is. When Cloudflare removed it from their platform, its chief executive, Matthew Prince, said something very important. He said, I've made that decision myself, and now we have to discuss why I should not be allowed to make that decision. And he said, in the not-so-distant future, if we are not already there, it may be that if you're going to put content on the internet, you'll need to use a company with a giant network like Cloudflare, Google, Microsoft, Facebook, Amazon, or Alibaba. We did a report earlier this year called The Platform Press, How Silicon Valley Re-Engineered Journalism at the Town Centre, where we interviewed dozens of newsroom operatives and lots of people who worked in the platform companies that deal with journalists. And what we found, you'll be unsurprised to hear, is very much sort of what we've seen unfold in the months really since we brought this report out. So it came out in March, before the hearings, before the stories about Russian propaganda had broken. And we said, essentially, the design of technology platforms is discriminating against high-quality journalism. This is an accident in most cases, but it is something that needs to be put right. My favorite chart from the, which is known as our green dot chart for very obvious reasons. Down the left-hand side, I don't know if you can see them there, those are all publishers, and they're all manner of different publishers, so they range from the Wall Street Journal through to BuzzFeed. And then across the top, you've got 21, I think, different platforms there. Each green dot represents where each of the publishers is currently creating or shaping content for different platforms. So in other words, this is not sort of just a case of people posting a few links on Twitter. This is newsrooms having to reorient the resources that they have around serving a social media ecosystem, which doesn't just really host material. It hosts, it monetizes, and it commissions. So we now have social media platforms that pay journalists and journalism organizations directly. This may, in fact, be a very good thing. I think there are lots of people who are hoping that that will be the answer to some of journalism's problems. But again, sorry, I'm bringing lots of bad news into the room. Hopefully these are things that we can discuss and be more optimistic about later. Let me just move that on. We also looked at how much of this material was linking back to news sites and how much was just sitting within the apps of the technology platforms. Now, the far left-hand side, these two great big blue columns, shows you how much content, when we counted in a week, linked back to the publisher's own site. So that's the slightly higher column. But we were really shocked by how much content is now created specifically for the technology platforms themselves. So in other words, none of that traffic is going back to your site. All of that traffic is keeping readers, all of that content is keeping readers within a third-party website. This is perhaps the best illustration recently of what this dependency is doing to newsrooms. I don't know if you have in Korea something called pivot to video, but pivot to video is a phenomenon whereby in the past year, a lot of newsrooms, including Mashable, Mic, Fox Sports, Huffington Post, have all cut journalists from their newsrooms saying, we can't afford to do that kind of journalism anymore, but we have to pivot to video because this is where we are hearing all the advertising is going. This is a worry for reporting resource in newsrooms because video production takes a very different type of resource. And the pivot to video is being ordered really by the platforms, specifically Facebook, and to some extent YouTube, because they want to incentivize publishers to create more material for their platforms. When Mic, this is one graph from one of the publishers, sourced from Digiday, when Mic cut their newsroom and pivoted to video, which you can see happened in about March 2017, one very dramatic thing happened to their traffic, which is it just really declined. So in other words, you have a sort of a dictation of strategy, which does not necessarily mean that your journalism is going to be more seen or even necessarily more profitable. So in a way, we can see how this exercise of power in the market does not always take into account the ultimate consequences of this, which is it might not work. But it's a measure of how desperate advertising-based businesses are, that they will change their business model, if you like, in the promise of greater revenues and find that they don't, in fact, materialize. There are businesses now which are built entirely within social media. This is one, Now This News. If you go to their homepage, it says, homepage, even the word sounds old. We bring the news to you in your social feed. So in other words, these are businesses like Now This News, BuzzFeed is probably the most famous, which have said it doesn't really matter if we have an independent platform. What we actually have to do is live within the ecosystems of the bigger technology companies. So this social first strategy, if you like, is something which is now also in doubt. What's happening is that we are seeing in these areas where journalism is under pressure or crumbling, that Google and Facebook are in fact getting not less involved, but more involved in the market. Again, I'm leaving this as an open question. It would be very interesting to hear people's views and have a discussion about this. But in two areas. So first of all, there is a new initiative in the States called Report for America, which is intending to put 1,000 journalists into local newsrooms. It is co-funded by Google, who are funding about 25% of it. It's also co-funded by local newsrooms and by non-profits. And then we also have the Facebook Journalism Project, where Facebook is going into local newsrooms, talking to their journalists and helping them build new tools to use Facebook better. Now, this could be a path to sustainability. What it definitely is large-scale technology companies coming in to where once there was an independent press and helping rebuild journalism in those markets. This is, I think, leading us to a moment where we have to make a decision as journalists about what we want to do with our own industry. Let's move that on. Recently, Ethan Zuckerman, who is a great American scholar who I really urge that everybody, if you don't read his papers, please do, because he founded Global Voices. He's a really smart person when it comes to thinking about this problem. of how independent should we be. He talks about the press being a counter-democratic institution. So in other words, it needs to hold power responsible. As democratic institutions of power change, he says, counter-democratic systems have to change as well. So in other words, and he says, nostalgia for how the press used to work is less helpful than understanding the way in which political and civic power are changing, so the press can continue to act as an effective counterweight. I think this is a really important thing for everybody to think about, and I know that we urge our students to think about it at Columbia, which is how do we build the kinds of institutions that can integrate with technology power but also act as a counterweight to them. One answer to this, rather ironically, is Jeff Bezos, who owns the Washington Post. He also founded Amazon. The Washington Post is probably the most successful example of press transformation currently in America. What they have done is they have hired as many, they've put an extra 70, I think, journalists into the newsroom, and they've put an equal number of developers into their development and the product departments. They've built advertising systems and platforms themselves. They have built a technology company inside a newspaper company. And as somebody said, if Jeff Bezos is your chief product manager, that's a pretty good place to be. The big question for the press is whether or not you actually need a billionaire to be able to manage this kind of transformation. There are also other ways in which the American journalism is adapting. And two of them are the most unlikely, possibly sort of success stories. In 2005, 2006 at The Guardian, I was launching podcasts and newsletters. And in about 2010, 2011, they were being abandoned, and everyone said, these are so old-fashioned. Why would you be putting out a newsletter on email or a podcast instead of doing video? These are two of the fastest growing sectors for journalism now in America. They are not big in terms of revenue, but they are extremely successful and innovative. Bottom right-hand side, we have Jessica Lessin, who produces a technology newsletter called The Information. She is a very smart person embedded in Silicon Valley, who, when she saw our green dot chart, said it is everything wrong with American journalism in one chart. You have to hold on to your own material. You have to find your own path to market. Podcasting as well just is not platform dependent in the same way that video is. So those who are wanting to build audiences, and particularly build audiences offline, so, you know, the actual people who will come and hear your podcast being recorded now will create a very sort of loyal fan base for your journalists. One of the most successful new podcasts in America is something called The Daily, which is produced by the New York Times, and it's essentially what was in the paper or what was on the website, just distilled down every morning, sent out early, discussions with the journalists who are involved. But the style in which it's done is very, very compelling, and it's built a huge audience very, very quickly, and it is completely independent. And here is the other thing which is happening in American journalism. So everything has been quite gloomy until this part, till 2 slides from the end, where suddenly I'm being more optimistic. So I was part of the thinking at The Guardian that said we must be free. We must be free and we must reach a big audience. And this would be in 2000, 2001, 2002. 15 years later, scale and reach just is not a business model which works for most high-quality news outlets. So subscription, which many people said would not work, is becoming the default way that serious newsrooms are making money. And what we've seen is something called the Trump bump in 2017. Every time Donald Trump mentions that the press are the enemies of the people, or that the Washington Post is fake news, sorry, the Amazon Washington Post, he calls it, or the New York Times is fake news, they get thousands of new subscribers. The stated aim of the New York Times is to have $800 million of annual revenue from digital sources by 2020. When they announced this aim 2 years ago, nobody thought that they would make it, but actually now everybody thinks that it is possible that they will reach that target. If they do, I believe we'll have seen one of the most extraordinary transformations in a large press institution, and certainly not one that people 10 years ago thought was possible. So the bright part of this is that news organizations that are taking control of their own destiny and building what they call owned and operated businesses away from social media, or maybe sometimes at the same time as integrating more with platforms, are actually the ones who are best placed to survive the next turn of the cycle. I don't think that anybody would have predicted 15 years ago that the New York Times and the Washington Post would be two of the strongest digital brands, not just in America, but probably in the English-speaking world. And yet here we are. And it comes down to essentially belief in very, very strong independent journalism and big investments in technology as well. I think that building our own owned and operated technologies, our own revenue streams, and our own audiences away from large-scale platforms is part of journalism. But it's not just about building by ourselves, it's also about collaboration. So the last thing really that I wanted to say was that this should not be a solo project. We are not journalists now. Journalism organizations, particularly investigative organizations and accountability organizations, have to work together. We are too small. There are too few of us not to really leverage each other's skills. This is very counterintuitive for press markets where there's always been intense competition. But this is the ICIJ, which published the Panama Papers, and now something called the Paradise Papers. I don't know if they get another leak, whether they'll have to find something else beginning with P. The Paradise Papers investigation into offshore tax havens. The critical thing about this is, as well as the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, they had 95 different news organizations around the world who mined parts of this enormous data set in order to get their own stories out of it. This, to me, feels like the future of a particular type of reporting. We also saw in America, when I arrived 7 years ago from the UK, our market is much more like the Korean market. We have the BBC, which is a very healthy public media organization. In America, there was really very little public media. There was NPR and PBS, both of which were quite small, though they've both grown a great deal due to digital. And there was no not-for-profit journalism. Now you have, again, collaborative organizations like ProPublica, which everybody said would fail, now becoming the mainstream. And the mainstays of investigative journalism in America. So I really believe I'm going to stop in a minute for questions. This is Siri. What I wanted to say really was, if you sum this up, we're at a moment where, as journalists and news organizations, we really have to make a decision how we're going to invest and whether we are going to build our own future and collaborate into a new future for journalism and build a path together that goes forward, because nobody really wants to go backwards. And I think that this question about what is our right relationship with big technology platforms remains the key question that we all have to answer. It would be great, incidentally, if Google, Facebook, Twitter recognized that in being a separate in being a supporters for the free press, they cannot necessarily be the free press. And if they want the free press to flourish, then they must find ways as well of actually making that financial transfer between their vast wealth and the producers who are creating high-quality journalism, many of whom I'm sure are here today. So I want to say thank you very much again to the Korean Press Foundation And thank you to you for listening, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion about how we deal with this power problem over the next 2 days. Thank you.
네, 그러면 바로 이어서 질의응답 세션을 진행해 보도록 하겠습니다. 여러분들이 질문을 주셨는데 그 가운데 저희가 시간 관계상 2가지의 질문을 추렸습니다. 먼저 에밀리 벨 교수님께 드릴 첫 번째 질문입니다. 네, 교수님께서는 플랫폼과 언론을 주제로 지금 현재 전 세계에서 또 가장 중심지라고 할 수 있는 미국에서 특히 일어나고 있는 그들과의 관계 그리고 문제점 그리고 사례를 들어서 설명을 해주셨습니다. 첫 번째 질문은 플랫폼을 언론사로 봐도 될까요? 또 플랫폼에게 저널리즘을 요구해도 될까요? 다소 원론적인 질문이네요.
Sorry, my thing is not working. David, did you hear that?
네, 제가 다시 한번 말씀을 드릴게요. 통역기가 지금 안 된 것 같아서.
Sorry, it's not. It was on 2, but it's no.
Thank you
Sorry.
so much.
Right. Thank you. That's a great question. Thank you to my translator, Professor David Levy. Well, so I started off I spent 2 years insisting to Facebook that they were publishers and them saying, no, we were absolutely not publishers. And now Facebook seem to have changed their minds a little bit and they're saying, we are. My worry in a way, I think, is different now, which is I get the sense that they want journalism to succeed, but such is the culture that they really want it to do it maybe kind of, on their terms or themselves. So I think in a way it would be better if they really recognized that they were journalistic organizations, or at least that they had a journalistic role, because then it would enable us to have a proper negotiation about what kind of support they're really giving producers. A lot of the problems that we've seen is just the fact that they see themselves as publishing everything in a very, what they would say was neutral way. But it's not neutral at all. It's actually the opposite of neutral. It allows a kind of authoritarian, angry content to really dominate, and it doesn't allow high-quality journalism to be properly funded. So if Mark Zuckerberg said, I'm a journalist, I mean, he's not a journalist, but if he were to say, I'm a publisher, and I want to really make sure that journalists and particularly reporters are supported, I think that that would be a good thing. It would make lots of people very uneasy. Dan Gilmore included, he's nodding his head. But the trouble is, I think that we're halfway there already, but we just haven't had, if you like, we're in the worst place possible right now, which is the platforms are exercising their power over what's published. It is not transparent because they say it is part of their business model to be untransparent. And it's not helping journalism enough because it doesn't really pick up the responsibility for supporting high-quality reporting.
네, 두 번째 질문 그러면 이어가도록 하겠습니다. 이분은 친절하게 영어로 해주셔서 통역기를 착용하시는 동안 그대로 읽어드릴게요. Korea has too many media companies compared to platform companies. 2 platform companies versus about 6,000 media companies. What do you think about proper cooperation in this situation?
So the question is, what about scale and balance? In other words, how easy is it to cooperate with each other? If that was the question. I mean, I don't know if I got the question quite right, but the balance of power is not even at the moment, simply because of the economic size of the platform companies. If you consider that Google and Apple between them have about $500 billion just in cash that they're waiting to spend on something. That's, that's a really, you have an enormous amount of concentration and centralization in a very small number of companies. The question of the number of media outlets, I think, is an interesting one, because we've always thought that plurality depends on having many different media outlets. I know certainly sort of in my market in the UK, we have an incredibly competitive media market, particularly in daily news. My worry is that we're going to see a huge, I think, erasure of journalistic institutions, simply because there will not be enough money for them all to survive. And when you look at the engineering or the architecture of social platforms, what they really do is they elevate the individual voice more than they elevate the brand or the publication. Now, we're seeing some changes by Facebook or Google to maybe elevate the brand a little bit. But really, we're in a place where things like influencer networks are becoming the advertising engine of the future. And it's going to be very, very hard, I think, to maintain large newsrooms which can do long stories over a long period of time. And those brands don't have a huge amount of meaning, perhaps, to a generation which is actually growing up listening to individuals. The problem is that sort of journalism is really a team sport. So when we talk about, how many different organizations there are, I think that actually, one of the really promising trends has been this emergence of a different type of organization. So the ICIJ is a different type of organization. We never had organizations that worked quite like that 20 or 30 years ago. Even if they existed, they were doing journalism in a very different way. We never had organizations like ProPublica, which always works in partnership with other news organizations. So my feeling is that there isn't an equality at the moment. There's no equality really between the direction that tech is moving and the direction that journalism is moving. However great the journalistic organization, there isn't a single one out there at the moment that I know of which is feeling comfortable about its future. But it does mean, I think, that, we're in real danger of losing that diversity. And just one point about the American market at the moment, you can see there's a real reluctance to regulate, but there are changes happening which allow certain broadcasters, for instance, more power in the local market. So just 2 weeks ago, the FCC removed the requirement for local news television stations to have a station in their territory, in their own sort of their own license region. And this enables things like Sinclair Media and Fox News and the big broadcasters to really take journalists out of local settings and centralize what they do as well. So I think we have to be really careful about this sort of mirroring of big organizations, saying that 2 or 3 big broadcast organizations will counterweight somehow social media organizations. My real worry is that local news and small market news is just going to disappear. It's just not going to survive.